Hey everybody, it's Bust, continuing the preview season for Fates Voyage Onward. Today, we are going to be discussing the spoilers for the Explorers. And so the Explorers, all across the top row here, there are 5 multi-faction Explorers. They all have the same play ability that when you play the unit from your hand, you pick an Explorer spell to create in your hand. And so the Explorer spells, you may be asking yourself, what are those? They appear down here on the bottom row. Unfortunately, Janna, not an Explorer spell. She's just hanging out with all of her Explorer spell friends here, but interesting collection of cards. One that gives you kind of a minor quicksand, one that destroys an equipment, one that gives a little bit of heal, and one that destroys a landmark. And so the first thing I thought of when I immediately saw these was I don't remember how the husks were spoiled. I feel like as Evelyn and the husks were spoiled, they maybe just showed us like 1 or 2. And then they were just kind of like, oh yeah, there's going to be 10. There's going to be 1 for each faction, but they didn't tell us what they actually were until the set was released. I have to assume that there's going to be an Explorer spell for each faction, as these play abilities aren't entirely shown how they work here. We said, well, maybe the faction generates that, and so you do have the Shadow Isles Targon one that has a Shadow Isles and Targon spell down below, but then as you move on to Noxus Shurima, that works, but then the remaining ones don't. And so we're not certain, how this is going to work. In my opinion, it's probably just kind of like Manifest, to where you get shown 3 options and you just get to pick one. But at the end of the day, there's no real way to tell. But I can tell you about all of these units. They all pass that kind of conchologist test as to where, am I getting enough reasonable stats out of a card that generates another card? And we are. These are all pretty reasonable cards across the board. Just from the kind of stats perspective, it strikes me as the Freylord Demacia one is just being kind of the best. It has only a -1 stat point, right? You're only getting 5 stats out of a 3-cost unit, but having Challenger and 3 health means that it can pick on a lot of the smaller units of the game. That's the one that just kind of immediately strikes me as being the best, but I'll assure you that all of these cards are playable. We've seen time and 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 time again, any card within the game, kind of regardless of what its stat line is, if it comes down and generates another card, it's probably worthwhile, especially as these cards are all in the cheaper end of the spectrum. And so as I look at them, I'm not like really excited about Portal Pioneer. The 1/1 for 2 that gives you a refund on your mana doesn't strike me as that great. The Armed Acquisitioner feels like the kind of mid one of the group, as to where it seems like it'll probably see the most play because its stat line is pretty aggressive, but 1 health can be kind of a bane. And then the Spectral Surveyor and the Scholarly Pioneer both strike me as being a little bit above average, just having strong keywords on a reasonably statted body. And so, if we are in that space of, the size of these units is all fine, and we know we get to play a card and generate a card, it's really going to come down to how useful these Explorer spells are. And so, depending on how it goes and how that is in effect, is it this space to where you can only generate out of your own factions, and so the Noxus Shurima one generates this quicksand and this landmark thing, and that kind of sucks, right? It's just way too situational for these cards to ever be really of use. And so I'm kind of interested to see how this goes, and as whether or not we get kind of like locked into this space to where you have so many bad generations that these cards just don't feel quite worth it. And so in my brain, in my mind, I'm sure that there's like a Demacian one that comes out and just gives a unit on the board +2/+2 for 2 mana, or I'm sorry, +1/+1 for 2 mana. It's not a great deal, but it does something. I'm sure the Ionia one does something obnoxious, like give a unit elusive, but these just all feel like things to me as to where the way that the metas have broken down in Runeterra over the course of the history of the game is that the meta is so varied that having these kind of like real direct answers to cards just isn't that necessary. And so if you're out grinding the ladder, some landmark based deck is the #1 deck in the format. You don't really see yourself going out there and playing Scorched Earths, right? You just you don't run into that matchup enough for the card to be that relevant. That's why cards like Passage Unearned just absolutely never see play. I think that's what it's called, the Shadow Isles thing, that to where if a unit was summoned this turn but not played, it gets removed from the game. Like those cards, you'll see it like once in 1,000 games and be like, oh, I guess you got me, bro. But it's never enough density of the style of deck in play that really warrants that kind of directed card. And so in my mind, these explorer kind of things probably need to have some generalized stuff kind of attached to it, and that's where I fall in that space of, well, maybe there's some kind of unit bonus kind of thing, maybe there's one that draws a card, like that kind of stuff could legitimately exist at this 2 mana speed and still feel pretty fair, but also be in the space to where when you roll an exploration, you aren't just like completely blanked out of a game. And so we're out here playing against elites. We take our roll and then we hit the malfunction in the excavation, and we're like, cool, that just did absolutely nothing. I think Riot's going to have a little bit more in place to make those feels bad kind of moments not really land as often. And so hopefully these cards don't fall into that zone to where the manifests all suck and then you're just playing these as kind of like a free value generating kind of card that you can then discard to your blowback or something, and they have a lot more use outside of that space. Now, a couple of other things I wanted to call out with these. One of the first things I kind of peeked at was I immediately noticed the Demacia Freylord one, and I was like, oh, cool, that's a combat cook. And then I looked over to the right, and I was like, that's the PNZ Bilgewater one, and I was like, oh, cool, that is the Attune Weapon Master. I was like, are they really going to carry along? Like, I was very curious if we're going to end up in this space in Runeterra to where we have like really defined dual faction kind of things. And there has been a bit of shakeup in here, right? If we're thinking directly of the Weapon Masters, the 1-cost Weapon Master was Shurima and Shadow Isles. The 2-cost Weapon Master was Noxus and Ionia. And so there is a bit of breakup amongst these. Riot Dirtle did make a couple of notes on these as I scrolled through the Twitter. He says that the Weapon Master pairs were a bit tough to design for since several of the region pairs don't share a lot of complementary mechanics, and so this region works better for deck speed common to those regions, and they repeated too because they do work. And so I'm very interested to see if this kind of dual faction thing really pushes itself forward. These are a lot of strategies that have just kind of naturally worked well together anyways, right? You would have the Nightfall strategies out of Shadow Isles Targon, you have Reputation out of Noxus and Shurima. Moving down the line, you have like the Weapon Masters out of Demacia Freylord, and then you have Bad Spells Attune coming out of PNZ Bilgewater. And so there is going to be, so hopefully some kind of future precedent running with these. I think that that's a space that Riot hasn't particularly explored up to this point. The other thing of note within the Riot Dirtle notes here were the spells themselves. The goal here was to set the spells as a reasonable baseline for these effects in each region, aiming for a less potent version than the intentionally powerful version within these roles. So you can compare Scorched Earth to the landmark removal, and you can compare Quietus to the equipment removal. So it's valuable access to tech for the other factions, but not necessarily as good as what you would get within your own faction. And I think I'm kind of fine with that. I feel like over the past year, maybe the past year and a half, Riot has done an exceptional amount of work in terms of really kind of defining home and driving home what regions are supposed to be good at. We saw a lot of that tied back into the rotation, and now we're starting to get to really feel that, say, okay, PNZ is good at dealing damage to units, Noxus is good at striking units, Demacia is good at combating units where the units strike each other, Ionia gets recalls, Shadow Isles gets this pure unit destruction, and it's really kind of coming out and defining what these factions can do. And now that they've done that, I think it's pretty okay to kind of branch out into this space and say, okay, well, you're playing Noxus today. You can have some access to heal, right? You can have access to the Explorer's refreshments down here, but it's going to take you a lot of work to actually get access to that effect. You have to play this Explorer unit that's a little bit understated, and then he's going to have to come out and actually generate the piece that you want, and so it may not function how you want it to all of the time, and you may just outright miss. And I think that that's fine, as opposed to saying that this faction just never gets access to anything, to put it behind kind of like a real barrier of access. And so it's very interesting to me to see this style of card come out, and how the other factions get access to things they wouldn't typically have access to. And so that's it. That's the spoiler season for today. I'm excited to get to try these out. I just look at the Noxus one and the Demacia one and say, Yeah, we're going to be playing those. But without more information, it's going to be a little bit challenging to really drive home these. Once we find out what the mechanics do and if these is the extent of the spells, then we can start to make some more generalizations there. And so, good stuff. That is going to do it for us today. I hope everyone enjoyed the video. I hope you maybe learned a thing or two along the way, and you had a good time watching. So this is Bust, and we thank you for being here.